The morning Olive Slater rode onto Amos Easton's land. She was carrying nothing but a worn canvas satchel, a rifle she barely knew how to fire, and a desperation so deep it had hollowed out the space behind her eyes. The year was 1878, and the Kansas prairie stretched in every direction like a bolt of amber cloth pulled taut to its edges, golden and unforgiving under the September sun. Amos was crouched beside the fence line at the eastern edge of his property when he heard the horse, a sound that did not belong to any animal he recognized, the uneven rhythm of a creature that had been pushed past comfort and was now simply enduring. He straightened up slowly, one hand shading his eyes, the other still holding the length of wire he had been stretching between posts. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulder, with hands that had been calloused since he was 14, and a face that the Kansas sun had done its honest work on. He watched the rider approach and said nothing, because Amos Easton was a man who had learned long ago that words cost something when they were used carelessly. The horse was a grella mare with a hollow belly, and the woman on her back was not much better off. She pulled up about 10 yards away and looked at him with the directness of someone who had been humiliated enough times in the last few weeks that pride had become a luxury she could no longer afford. She was 26, with dark hair braided loosely over one shoulder and eyes the color of creek water over gray stone. Her dress had been mended at the sleeve. Her boots were good quality but worn thin at the sole. "Are you Amos Easton?" she asked. "I am," he said. "My name is Olive Slater. I heard in Caldwell that you lost your field hand 2 weeks ago and that you are short on help before the winter harvest." He looked at her steadily. "That is true." "I would like to work your farm," she said. "I can do most anything that needs doing. I grew up working land in Missouri. I know how to harvest, how to put up stores, how to tend animals, how to repair fencing." She paused, and the pause itself was an admission of something. "I would need a place to sleep and meals and a small wage. I'm not asking for much, just until spring." Amos looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the horse, at the satchel, at the rifle that sat awkwardly in the saddle scabbard the way a rifle does when its owner has not spent much time with it. He looked at her face, which was composed and steady in the way that people are composed and steady when composure is the last thing holding them together. "What happened?" he asked. She did not look away. "My husband passed in July, fever. I had to sell the homestead to cover his debts. His brother took the remainder of what was owed to the family, and I was left with the horse and the rifle and what I am carrying." She said it plainly, without self-pity, which somehow made it worse to hear. "I have been riding since the middle of August looking for honest work. I am not inclined toward taking charity, Mr. Easton. I want to work for what I receive." He looked back out at his fields. He had 80 acres, half of it corn and half of it planted with winter wheat that was just beginning to show green, and the truth was that he needed the help badly. His last hand had gone south to his family in Texas, and the man before that had drunk himself into uselessness over the summer. Amos was strong and capable, but he was one man and the land did not care about that. "There is a room off the back of the barn," he said. "It is clean and has a stove. The work starts before sunrise and does not stop until the light is gone. I pay fair wages, $2 a week, and you will eat what I eat at the table." He said the last part with some deliberateness, because he had known hired hands who were made to eat separately and he did not conduct himself that way. Olive Slater looked at him, and something in her expression shifted very slightly, like a knot that has not been untied but has been loosened a single turn. "Thank you," she said. "I will not give you cause to regret it." "I do not expect you will," he said, and went back to his fence. She dismounted and led the grulla toward the barn, and Amos watched from the corner of his eye as she moved with the careful, economical efficiency of someone who had been doing physical work their whole life. He felt something he did not immediately name, something that was not quite curiosity and was not yet anything else. Something that simply took note of her the way a well-made instrument takes note of a change in the air. That first evening, she appeared at the back door of the farmhouse at the time he had told her supper would be ready, and she came in clean-handed and without ceremony, and sat at the end of the table he pointed her toward. He had made cornbread and beans, and there was a small piece of salted pork on each plate. She ate without complaint, and when she was done, she said the meal was good and offered to wash the dishes. He let her because it seemed important to her that she contribute immediately, that she not be a guest even for one night. They did not talk much that evening. He sat by the window with a ledger book, and she sat at the other end of the table with her hands folded and looked out at the darkening prairie, and the quiet between them was not unfriendly. It was the quiet of two practical people who had both learned that silence was often more honest than conversation. The work began in earnest the next morning. Amos was already moving through the barn when she appeared at 4:30 in the morning, dressed in a simpler work dress with her hair pinned up and her sleeves rolled. She asked him what needed doing, and he told her, and she did it without argument or complaint or the kind of excessive cheerfulness that he had found in some hired hands, the kind that was its own form of performance. She worked in a straightforward and competent manner, and by the end of the first day he had revised his estimate of her considerably upward. She was not simply capable, she was skilled. She knew how to read a plant, how to look at the color and the posture of the corn and tell you what it needed. She had a feel for the soil that was almost instinctive, pressing her fingers into it and making small assessments about moisture and density that turned out to be accurate. She understood how to manage a team of horses, how to speak to animals in a low voice that settled them without drama. She repaired 3 sections of fence in the time he would have spent on 2, and she did it cleanly. By the end of the first week, Amos found himself thinking about her during the hours they worked separately, not in any way that alarmed him, simply in the way that a competent partner becomes part of your mental landscape of the day. By the end of the second week, he was aware that the evening meals had become the part of the day he looked forward to most, because she had begun to talk more, and what she said was worth listening to. She told him about Missouri, about the farm her father had kept, about how she had learned to do everything because her father had 3 daughters and no sons, and had seen no reason to let that stop him from running his farm properly. She told him about her late husband, Thomas, with the careful, measured grief of someone who had loved the person they married, but had also been clear-eyed about who that person was. Thomas Slater had been a good man and a bad farmer, she said, and she had known going in that she would carry most of the burden, and she had been willing to do that, and then he had died and left her with nothing but the burden and none of the reason for it. Amos listened the way he did everything, quietly and attentively, and occasionally he offered something in return. He told her about the farm, about how he had come to Kansas from Ohio 7 years earlier with his brother Daniel, and the 2 of them had built the house and the barn and the fencing with their own hands. He told her that Daniel had gone back east to marry a woman from Columbus and had taken a position in her father's hardware business and had not been back since. He said this without bitterness but without warmth either, and Olive heard the particular quality of that neutrality and understood it. "You miss him," she said. "I miss having someone else who knew what this land cost," he said. "Daniel knows now what a hardware shop costs. That is a different kind of knowing." She nodded and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think loneliness is its own kind of weather. You can get used to it, but you never stop noticing it." He looked at her across the table and thought that was one of the truest things anyone had said to him in a long time. October arrived with a cold that had teeth in it, the kind of prairie cold that came off the open land with nothing to slow it down, and the work shifted in its character. The corn had to come in, and it had to come in fast because the first real freeze was only weeks away. They worked from before sunrise to after sunset for 10 days straight, moving through the rows together, husking and loading, and their conversation during that time became something different than supper talk. It was the kind of talk that happens between people who are doing physical work side by side, immediate and unguarded, responding to what is right in front of them, The particular ear of corn that is too dry or the one that is just right, the horse that is pulling unevenly, the clouds building to the northwest that might mean weather. On the 8th day of harvest, a cold rain began in the early afternoon, and they kept working because there was no choice. And by evening they were both soaked through, and the wagon was loaded, and the barn doors were shut, and they were standing in the doorway of the barn looking out at the rain falling in gray sheets across the darkened field. Olive had her arms wrapped around herself, and her braid had come half undone, and there was mud along the hem of her dress, and she looked, Amos thought suddenly, entirely and completely herself, not worn or diminished by the work and the wet, simply real. "Good day's work," she said. "Good day's work," he agreed. She turned to go to her room off the back of the barn and then paused and looked back at him. "Thank you for not treating me like I am made of different material than I am," she said. "Some men see a woman doing field work and spend half their energy deciding whether to be impressed or concerned. You just let me work." He held her gaze for a moment. "You earn the same as anyone I have hired," he said. "There was no reason to treat you differently." She smiled then, briefly and genuinely, and it was the first real smile he had seen from her, not polite or managed but actually amused and warm, and it changed her whole face. And Amos Easton, who was a sensible and unsentimental man, walked back to his house in the rain thinking about nothing else for the rest of the evening. November came in hard and fast, and the fields were mostly put to rest, the winter wheat established and waiting for snow, the stored harvest accounted for and squared away in the cellar and the barn. The pace of the work slowed and changed, became more about maintenance and preparation, mending tools, cleaning the tack, reinforcing the barn walls against the wind, putting up additional feed. They fell into a rhythm that had a domestic quality to it now, the two of them moving through the farm's winter routines with an ease that had developed so gradually Amos almost did not notice it had happened. He noticed, though. He noticed everything, which was the problem. He noticed that she had begun leaving a cup of coffee on the workbench in the barn for him in the mornings, figured out by some means. He never witnessed exactly when he would arrive there, and having it ready. He noticed that she hummed to herself sometimes when she was doing repetitive work, not songs he could name but melodies that she seemed to be inventing as she went, low and meandering. He noticed that she laughed at things that were quietly funny rather than loudly obvious, that she had a particular sharp attention to the small absurdities of farm life, the rooster that crowed at the wrong hour every single day, the particular posturing of the old plow horse when he decided he had done enough work for one morning. He noticed that when she was thinking hard about something her left hand moved slightly, as though she were tracing something only she could see. He noticed that he was noticing these things, and he recognized what that meant, and he felt, honestly, somewhat inconvenienced by it. She had come to work until spring. She had said so herself. She had a plan and a trajectory, even if that plan was still being assembled, and he was her employer and she was living on his property because she had no other options right now, and there was nothing appropriate about a man in his position complicating that situation with feelings that had not been invited. So he said nothing. He maintained the distance that was appropriate to their arrangement, which was not a cold distance but a respectful one, and he focused on being the kind of employer she had said she appreciated, one who simply let her be what she was. The trouble was that she was what she was at every moment, and he was present at most of those moments. And winter on a Kansas prairie farm is not a large space with many places to not be close to someone. The first real snowfall came in late November, and the town of Caldwell was 6 miles to the north, and Amos made the supply run alone because the roads were uncertain, and there was no reason for both of them to go. When he returned, she was sitting at the kitchen table working on a piece of mending by the lamp, and the fire was burning well, and the smell of something cooking reached him before he got the door fully open. She had made a stew without being asked because he had been gone longer than expected, and the evening was cold, and it seemed like the practical and sensible thing to do. She explained, as though she needed to justify the small kindness. He sat down across from her and felt the warmth of the house and the warmth of the stew and the warmth of having someone be thoughtful without ceremony. And he thought, this is the thing I am going to have to be careful about. This exact thing right here. He brought her back a small paper bag from the general store in Caldwell. Peppermint candies, the kind in the glass jar by the counter. He had not planned to buy them. His hand had simply reached for them with the certainty of someone who knows exactly the right thing without being asked. He set the bag on the table next to her, mending without comment, and she picked it up and looked at it and then looked at him, and something passed between them that neither of them was prepared to name yet. "Thank you, Amos," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. "You are welcome, Olive," he said, and went to hang up his coat and stood with his back to her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. December, and the cold settled in for what it clearly intended to be a long stay. The days were short and the nights were very long, and the snow fell and stayed, and the world outside the farm became a white and silent and somewhat theoretical place. They spent more time inside, and the farmhouse, which Amos had lived in alone for 7 years, seemed to both expand and contract at once. Larger because there were 2 people in it with their own thoughts and private reserves of quiet, and smaller because those 2 people kept finding their way to the same room, the kitchen, the one with the best stove and the table and the lamp. She began reading in the evenings from the small collection of books he kept on the shelf beside the fireplace: 2 agricultural manuals, a Bible, a history of Ohio, and a worn copy of David Copperfield that had belonged to his mother. She read Dickens with visible pleasure and occasionally read passages aloud to him when she encountered something particularly good, not asking permission, simply sharing it the way you share something with someone you have stopped being formal with. He listened and sometimes responded, and sometimes just let the sound of her voice reading carry through the room, and the evenings had a fullness to them that he had forgotten was possible. On the 23rd of December, a rider came through from the south, a young man named Pete Howell who worked the cattle spread about 12 miles down, passing through on his way to Caldwell and stopping to water his horse and share news the way riders did. He sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and told them that a homesteading family about 4 miles east had lost their barn to fire 3 nights ago, a family named Greer with 5 children, and that they were managing but that it was hard going. Olive looked at Amos across the table. "I could spare some of the cured pork," he said. "I have some preserved corn put up that I could send," she said, not separating her stores from his stores, not calculating what was hers and what was his, just moving immediately to what could be done. Pete Howell took a loaded pack east with him when he left, and Olive and Amos sat back down at the table and looked at each other with the particular quiet satisfaction of people who have just done something straightforward and good. "You did not hesitate," she said. "Neither did you," he said. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he was learning to read, a slight thoughtfulness around the eyes, a measurement of something. Then she looked at the table. "I have been thinking about spring," she said. His chest tightened the way it did when he prodded a bruise. "What about it?" he said, keeping his voice level. "I have been thinking about where I might go," she said. "Whether west toward Colorado or south. I have a second cousin in Wichita who has written to say there might be work in a boarding house there." She paused. "I have been thinking about it and finding that I do not particularly want to do any of those things." He looked at her carefully. "What is it that you want to do?" he asked. She met his eyes. "I am not entirely sure," she said. "I think I wanted to say that out loud to someone, that the plan I arrived with is not the plan I still have." He nodded slowly. He wanted very much to say what was behind the tight feeling in his chest, and he also did not trust himself to say it correctly, and he also was deeply aware of the fact that she had been widowed 5 months ago and had lost everything and had come here without options, and he would not be the kind of man who took advantage of that situation. So he said, You do not have to go anywhere in spring if you do not want to. She looked at him. That is a generous thing to say. I mean it practically, he said. The work here does not end with spring. I could use a good hand through the planting season and the summer as well. The work is honest and the pay is fair and the arrangement has suited us both. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. It has. They left it there, in the careful space between what was true and what was being said. But something had shifted, something had been acknowledged, and the farmhouse that night felt like a different place than it had been that morning. January came, and with it a blizzard that lasted 3 days and reduced the world to a white roaring emptiness in every direction. They were confined to the house and the barn, moving between the two several times a day to care for the animals. And there was nothing to do in the evenings but talk and read and play cards with a worn deck that Amos kept in the kitchen drawer. Olive was very good at cards, which she admitted with transparent satisfaction, and she beat him at 3-card brag on 5 consecutive evenings, and he accused her of counting, and she said she was simply paying attention, which was not the same thing and also was entirely the same thing. On the 4th day, the blizzard broke and the world outside was so utterly still and white and crystalline that they stood in the doorway of the farmhouse together looking at it without talking for several minutes. The prairie under the new snow was beautiful in the way that very cold things sometimes are, precise and still and indifferent to whether it was observed. The sky was the particular blue of winter mornings, deep and clear and honest. My father used to say that snow was the land taking a rest, Olive said. Your father sounds like he thought carefully about things, Amos said. He did, she said, and there was a warmth in her voice that he was glad to hear, glad that the talk of her father brought that and not sorrow. He was a quiet man, but everything he said was worth hearing. I think I measure people by that standard and find most of them wanting. She glanced at him sideways. Not you. He felt that in a place that was not easy to feel things in. He said, I am glad to hear it. And it came out quieter than he intended, more honest than he intended. And she looked at him and looked away at the snow again, and the silence between them was full to the edges. February was the longest month and the coldest, and the one in which certain things became impossible to keep from being what they were. It was a Sunday evening, and the fire was burning well, and she was reading Dickens again, and he was at the table with the ledger books, going over the accounts for the season, and she began reading aloud, a passage from Copperfield about the quality of love that grows gradually and takes root before you know it. That is already part of the ground under you before you think to look down. She read it with the care she gave to things that mattered, and when she was done, she held the book in her lap and looked at the fire for a moment. I think that is true, she said. I think the kind of love worth having is the kind that grew when you were not watching. You look around one day and it is already there, already established, and you cannot quite say when the seed went in. Amos set down his pen very carefully on the ledger. He looked at her profile against the firelight. He thought about all the things he had been not saying for 4 months. He thought about the morning she had arrived on a half-starved horse, with nothing but her competence and her honesty. He thought about peppermint candies and coffee on the workbench, and the sound of her humming and the way she laughed at the rooster, and the way she read aloud to him as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He said, Olive. She turned from the fire and looked at him. I want to tell you something, and I need you to receive it in the spirit it is offered, he said, which is carefully and without any pressure attached to it whatsoever. She set the book down and gave him her full attention. I have been in love with you since approximately October, he said, and I have been keeping it to myself because your situation when you arrived here was one that I did not want to complicate, and because you told me you were staying until spring, and I did not want to be a reason you felt you had to leave sooner. He kept his voice steady and his hands flat on the table. I am not telling you because I expect anything in return. I am telling you because you just read me a passage about love that grows before you notice it, and I am sitting here knowing exactly what you mean, and it seemed dishonest to sit here and not say so. Olive Slater looked at him for a long time. The fire crackled and a log settled, and outside the wind moved across the prairie in the dark. And inside this house on this farm in this corner of Kansas, two people held a moment between them that was very still and very clear. Then she said, "Amos Easton, I have been in love with you since you put those peppermint candies on the table without saying a word about it, and then stood with your back to me for just a little too long." He let out a breath that felt like it had been held since September. She rose from her chair and came to the table and sat down in the chair next to his, close enough that their knees were nearly touching, and she looked at him with that creekwater gaze and said, "What do we do with that?" "I was hoping," he said, "that we might think about it honestly and see what makes sense." "I think what makes sense," she said slowly, "is that I have no desire to go to Wichita or Colorado or anywhere else. I think what makes sense is that this farm feels like mine too, and I am not sure when that happened, but it has, and you feel like mine too, and I am also not sure when that happened." She paused. "I know that it has only been 4 months and that some people would say that is too fast." "Some people were not here for those 4 months," he said. She laughed, and that real laugh, the one that changed her whole face, filled the kitchen, and he reached across the corner of the table and took her hand, and she let him, and the holding of it was comfortable and exact, as if they had done it before, as if the shape of her hand in his was something his hand already knew. They sat like that for a long time that evening, not speaking very much, not needing to. The fire burned down and they built it back up, and the wind crossed the prairie and the farm lay under its winter quiet. And inside the house, two people made a careful and certain kind of peace with what they felt, which was not complicated or confused, but was simply the truth. The way good soil is simply what it is, dark and patient and full of the capacity for growing. He courted her properly through February and into March, which on a farm means that the courtship happens around the edges of the work, a longer walk in the evening to check the winter wheat, a conversation over the mending of tack that goes on past when the tack is mended, the Sunday morning when he brought flowers from he could not even say where because the land was still half frozen, small prairie flowers he had found at the south end of the property where the soil warmed first, yellow and tentative and entirely serious in their intent. She kept them in a cup of water on the table until they were past keeping, and then she kept the dried remnants on the windowsill, and Amos saw them there every morning for the rest of the winter. In March, he went to Caldwell on a Tuesday morning and came back with a small ring that the jeweler in town had had in his case for 2 years, a simple band with a small oval of amber stone set into it, warm gold and genuine and nothing extravagant. He put it in his coat pocket and carried it for 4 days before he found the right moment, which arrived on a Saturday evening after supper when they were sitting on the porch in the cold watching the last of the winter color fade from the sky, wrapped in separate blankets and sitting in the 2 chairs he had brought out, their breath making small clouds. "Olive," he said. "I know what you are going to ask," she said, looking at the sky. "Do you?" "Yes," she said. "And the answer is yes." He took the ring out of his pocket anyway and held it out because it seemed right too, and she turned from the sky and looked at it and then looked at him, and her eyes were bright and he thought she might cry, but she did not. She simply took the ring and put it on and held her hand out to look at it in the last of the evening light, the amber catching the dusk. "It looks like it was made for this land," she said. "I thought the same thing when I saw it," he said. She reached across the gap between the chairs and took his hand, and they sat on the porch in the cold watching the dark come down across the Kansas sky, the stars appearing one by one with the methodical certainty they had been practicing for longer than either of them could comprehend. They married in Caldwell in early April of 1879, in the small white church at the north end of town, with the minister and a handful of witnesses who were mostly people Amos knew from the feed store and the land office. Olive wore a dress she had made herself over the winter from fabric she had purchased in Caldwell, a blue-gray color like the sky before rain, simple and well-made, and exactly right on her. Amos wore his good coat and had cleaned his boots, and had done something careful with his hair that she found very endearing and told him so quietly before they went inside. The ceremony was brief and honest, and neither of them cried, though the feed store owner's wife did, which surprised everyone, including the feed store owner's wife. They drove back to the farm in the wagon in the spring afternoon with the prairie greening around them, and Olive sat beside him on the bench seat with her shoulder against his and her hand in his, and the amber ring caught the April sun, and the Grella mare, now fat and healthy and properly tended, plodded contentedly behind on a lead rope, and the farm appeared ahead of them across the flat land like a destination that had always been marked on a map neither of them had known they were carrying. That spring they planted together. The winter wheat was already established and showing strong, but there was corn to go in and kitchen garden seeds, and a stand of sunflowers that Olive planted along the south side of the house because she said they were practical, for the seeds and the oil, but also because she had always wanted them there. Amos watched her plant the sunflower seeds in a long row, pressing each one in with her thumb at exactly the right depth, moving down the line with the focused patience that she brought to everything she did, and he felt something so large and settled and certain in his chest that he stood there with a hand on the fence post and let it fill him completely. She looked up and caught him watching. "You are not working," she said. "I am working," he said. "I am watching you to see if you are doing it right." "And am I?" "Perfectly," he said, and she knew he was not talking about the sunflowers. The summer of 1879 was a good season. The rains came at approximately the right times, and the corn grew tall, and the winter wheat that they harvested in June was the best Amos had produced in 3 years. They hired a hand for the summer harvest, a quiet young Mennonite man named Ezra who worked hard and spoke little, and seemed to find the arrangement entirely sensible. A married couple running a farm, each of them doing what they were best at, the farm itself clearly thriving under this doubled attention. In the evenings they sat on the porch, and the sunflowers that Olive had planted stood along the south wall of the house, chest-high now, and turning their heads toward whatever remained of the light. The prairie around them was full of the sounds of a working summer. Insects and birds and the distant low of cattle from Pete Howell's spread to the south. And the sky over Kansas in summer evenings was something that could not be adequately described, just experienced, wide and deep and luminous in a way that made a person feel both very small and very much included in something enormous. "I am happy," Olive said one evening, "the way you say something when you have been carrying it for a while and you finally want to put it down where it can be seen. I want to say that plainly. I am happy here." "So am I," he said, and reached over and covered her hand with his. In the fall of 1879, she told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, sitting across the table from him with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and her face carrying that look of careful composure that he now knew was how she held herself when something mattered very much. He looked at her and she looked at him, and then he got up from his chair and came around the table and crouched down beside her chair, the way a man does when words are not organized yet, but presence is the immediate thing, and she put her forehead against his temple, and they stayed like that for a moment, her hand coming up to hold the side of his face. "Well," he said finally. "Well," she agreed, and laughed into his shoulder, and he held her with a ferocity that surprised them both. Their son was born in late May of 1880, on a warm spring evening with the windows open and the smell of the planting season coming through, and the sunflowers just beginning to show their first buds along the south wall. They named him Walter James Easton, Walter for Olive's father and James for Amos's father, and he arrived into the world with a particular quality of loudness that the midwife from Caldwell said was a good sign, and that Amos privately thought was already very characteristic of the Slater side of his heritage. Walter was a healthy, curious, loud child who grew as fast as the summer corn. Olive fed him and worried about him, and also, crucially, did not let his existence stop her from being herself. She was back in the fields within 6 weeks, carrying him in a cloth sling against her chest while she worked, and the neighbors who came to call occasionally found this unusual in various directions. Either too much work for a woman with a new baby or too much baby for a woman trying to work. But Olive received all such opinions with a particular patient courtesy that made it absolutely clear she was going to do things exactly as she thought right. Amos had not expected to be the kind of father who was visibly moved by small things, but he was entirely that kind of father. He watched Walter learn to hold up his own head with the same attentive satisfaction he gave to watching a good crop establish itself. He built a crib with his own hands and sanded every surface 3 times. He got up in the night without being asked, when he heard the baby crying, and walked him in the kitchen in the dark while Olive slept, and did not consider this a sacrifice, considered it instead one of the more unexpectedly good things in a life that had been becoming increasingly full of unexpectedly good things. The early 1880s passed in the way that good years pass, which is to say quickly and without drama, but with a steady accumulation of things that matter. The farm grew. Amos expanded the operation, purchasing an additional 30 acres to the north from a neighbor who had decided to move his family to Colorado. They hired a permanent hand, a man named George Brandt, who was 40 years old and had been farming in Kansas for 15 years and knew the land well, and was entirely unsentimental about it, which Amos appreciated. Olive and George established a working relationship of mutual respect within about 2 weeks, based primarily on the fact that they both held very firm opinions about how to treat sick animals, and both turned out to be right. In 1882, a drought year that was hard on many of the farms in the region, Amos and Olive's farm came through better than most because Olive had been watching the soil moisture patterns for 2 years and had pushed them to plant the back 40 in sorghum rather than corn, sorghum being more drought-tolerant, and the back 40 produced adequately when many of the neighboring corn fields failed. Amos had trusted her reading of the land completely, had not second-guessed or overridden her judgment, had simply looked at what she showed him and said, "You are right. Let us do it." And she had looked at him with an expression that contained years of being overridden and doubted and managed, and what was in that expression when he simply trusted her was something he was glad he had done. Their neighbor to the east, a man named Harold Greer, the same family who had lost the barn to fire back in December of 1878, came to ask their advice about replanting that fall. Amos sent him to Olive first, because she was the one who had been thinking about it, and Greer went with the slight uncertainty of a man who was not accustomed to receiving farming advice from women, and came back with the slight recalibration of a man who has just received very good advice from someone he had underestimated. In 1883, their daughter was born, and they named her Clara Ruth, and she was from the beginning as different from her brother Walter as a sunflower is different from corn, quieter and more interior, watching the world with Amos's own quality of steady observation. Walter was 4 years old and responded to his sister's arrival with what could charitably be described as diplomatic neutrality, which Olive said was very much like his father, and Amos said he did not know what she meant by that, and she looked at him in a way that suggested she knew exactly what she meant, and that it was fond. The town of Caldwell grew during these years, as Kansas grew and the cattle trade continued, and the railroad brought more people and more commerce. The farm was no longer at the edge of an empty world, but at the edge of a developing one, and Amos and Olive both felt this. Both had to make adjustments in how they thought about the land they were working. There were more neighbors, more community obligations, more of the social fabric of a real town. Olive, who had been living a largely isolated life for the first years on the farm, took to this with an enthusiasm that surprised Amos slightly, and then did not surprise him at all when he thought about it, because she was someone who liked people, who was interested in them and had a natural gift for making them feel known, and she had simply not had much opportunity to exercise that gift. She became involved in the establishment of a schoolhouse in the community in 1884, when enough children had accumulated in the area to make a proper school both necessary and possible. She was on the committee that organized it and wrote letters to the county, and sat in meetings with men who were sometimes patronizing, and navigated all of that with a patience and a competence that ultimately produced a result: a building and a teacher, and a school year that began in the fall of 1884. Walter started school that fall, aged 4.5, perhaps a bit young, but with a stubbornness about wanting to attend that was impossible to argue with. It was during the school committee work that Olive became close friends with a woman named Rosalind Marsh, who had come to Kansas from Virginia with her husband 2 years earlier. Rosalind was sharp and funny and read widely, and had opinions about everything and was not shy about them. And she and Olive took to each other immediately with the ease of people who have been somewhat alone in their own minds and have just found someone who thinks at the same speed. Amos liked Rosalind and found her company entertaining, and her husband Marcus, a quiet man who kept horses, was someone Amos could share a fence-building afternoon with in comfortable silence, which was its own form of friendship. The mid-1880s were complicated years for Kansas in ways that were larger than any one farm. The politics of the cattle trade were shifting. The conflict between farmers and ranchers that had been simmering along the trails for years was coming to a head in various places, and the rights of the farming homesteaders to fence their land and protect their crops from cattle drives became a genuine point of contention. Amos had fencing disputes with a cattle operation to the south run by a man named Gordon Webb, who ran cattle along what had traditionally been an open route, and found the expansion of farm fencing an interference with his business. There were 2 incidents with Webb's men cutting Amos's wire fence in the fall of 1885, and Amos went to speak to Webb about it directly, which was a conversation that held a certain amount of tension and ended with a clarity on both sides about where things stood. Webb was not a villain, simply a man whose interests were genuinely in conflict with Amos's, and the resolution they eventually reached, a specific documented route for the cattle drive that respected the farm boundaries, was the kind of resolution that required both men to accept something less than they wanted and to find it acceptable anyway. Olive had been the one to suggest the documented route, drawing it out on a piece of paper at the kitchen table, seeing the geometry of the thing in a way that had not occurred to either Amos or Gordon Webb. She presented it to Amos, and he took it to Webb, and Webb looked at it for a long time, and then said it was reasonable, and the fencing was repaired and the wire was not cut again. "You should have come to that meeting," Amos told her that evening. "Webb would not have listened to me in that meeting," she said, without particular bitterness. "He would have been listening to the fact that I was a woman instead of what I was saying. You told him the same thing and he heard it." Amos looked at the map she had drawn, still on the table. "That is an injustice," he said. "It is," she agreed. "I am not going to let it stop me from figuring things out, but I am also not going to pretend it is not what it is." He looked at her and thought about everything she had navigated since arriving at his fence line 7 years ago with her careful composure and her hollow-bellied horse, and he thought about how much she had done and how much of it she had had to do around and through, and in spite of the particular obstacles that were placed in front of her specifically, and he felt something that was equal parts admiration and anger on her behalf. "You are the finest farmer I know," he said, "in this county or any other." She looked at him across the table. Her hair had gone slightly gray at the temples, which had happened gradually over the last couple of years and which he found, if anything, made her more beautiful, more real, more fully herself. "You are not an objective judge," she said. "I am an extremely objective judge," he said. "I have worked alongside you for 7 years. I know exactly what you can do." She smiled, and it was the real smile, the one that changed her whole face, and she reached across the table and took his hand in the way she had taken it 100 times by now, comfortable and certain and right. In 1886, Olive's mother passed away in Missouri, and Olive went back for 3 weeks to settle what needed settling. It was the longest Amos had been apart from her since the early days of their marriage, and he found the farm strange without her in a way that went beyond the practical absence of her labor, though that was also genuinely felt. George Brandt ran the operation well, and Walter, who was 6, had already developed his mother's facility with animals and was more help than you might expect a 6-year-old to be. But the evenings were hollow in a particular way, and the kitchen table was a different thing with only one person at it, and Amos's sleep was worse than usual. He wrote her a letter every 2 days, and she wrote back, and the letters were not effusive or poetic, but they were full of each other, full of the specific and the real. And reading them, he thought again about what she had said that February evening before they had spoken plainly to each other, about the love that grew when you were not watching, the kind that was already in the ground before you thought to look for it. She came back on a Thursday afternoon in October, and he heard the wagon on the road a good 10 minutes before it arrived because he had been listening for it, and he walked out to meet her at the gate the way he would not normally have walked out, the way that was in fact somewhat more revealing than he might have intended, and she looked at him from the wagon seat with the amber ring catching the October sun and said, "Hello, Amos," with a warmth in it that made the 3 weeks collapse into nothing. As if the time apart was already becoming simply a thing that had happened, and this right here, was the continuing fact. The late 1880s brought more children and more growth. In 1887, Olive was 35 and surprised both of them by becoming pregnant again, an event they both received with joy that contained within it an awareness that they were no longer as young as they had been, and that this was likely the last time. Their second son was born in the spring of 1888, and they named him Daniel Olive Easton, the Olive being Amos's idea. And when Olive heard him suggest it, she looked at him for a long moment with an expression he could not entirely read, and then said, "That is a very kind thing to do," with her voice lower than usual, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned against him in the way she did sometimes when she was full up with something. Young Daniel, who was called Danny almost immediately to distinguish him from his name in formal use, was a compact and cheerful child from the start, round-faced and persistent, the kind of small person who decides at 8 months that he is going to walk and simply works at it until he does. Walter, who was 8 when Danny was born, took his role as older brother with a seriousness that amused and touched his parents equally. Clara, at 5, treated the baby with a proprietary affection that suggested she had decided he was her specific responsibility, a position she maintained with considerable effectiveness. The farm was a full place by the end of the 1880s, full of work and children and animals, and the particular kind of noise that both sorts of production make. And Amos, who had spent 7 years in a farmhouse with only himself for company before a woman appeared at his fence line on a September morning with a hollow-bellied horse and a careful composure, thought sometimes in the evenings about what that before had felt like, that quiet and its particular weight, and could not now fully reconstruct it from memory, could not locate it in the feeling of the house as it now was. The 1880s gave way to 1889, and Kansas was making itself into the state it was becoming more permanently, the wildness settling into something with edges and official names, and the prairie that Amos had ridden across with the sense of it being boundless and unwritten was now crossed with roads and fences, and the marks of habitation in every direction. Progress was real and had costs, and both Amos and Olive felt this in ways they talked about sometimes, evenings on the porch. There was a community of exodusters, black families who had come to Kansas from the South following Reconstruction, who had settled to the north of Caldwell over the past decade, farming their own land with the particular determination of people who were doing something that was not simply economic, but also profound. Amos and Olive had had several of their neighbors from that community come through for trading and for help during hard times, and had extended the same ordinary courtesy they extended to anyone, which was perhaps less remarkable in theory than it turned out to be in practice, given how some of their other neighbors chose to behave. Olive in particular was direct and warm with everyone who came to the farm, and would hear no discussion of it being otherwise, and Amos was completely in agreement. In 1890, the year that would later be noted as the official closing of the frontier, though no one felt a gate shut on that particular day, Amos and Olive's farm had become what it was going to be: 110 acres of established Kansas farmland, well-built and well-managed, with a house that had been added onto twice, and a barn that was solid, and a second smaller barn that housed the equipment and the growing collection of tools and implements that a decade of investment had produced. There were neighbors in every direction and a road that went to Caldwell in 45 minutes by wagon, and the town of Caldwell itself had grown into something with real stores and a newspaper and a school and a church, and all the permanent fixtures of a place that intended to stay. Walter was 10 years old and already farming with the serious competence of someone who had been watching it done right his whole life. Clara was 7 and reading with a veracity that her mother recognized and her father found deeply pleasing. Danny was 2 and was into everything, and had recently demonstrated his preference for the company of the pigs over any other member of the family, a preference that was reciprocated by the pigs. That fall, Amos and Olive sat on the porch on the evening of their 11th anniversary of arriving at a kind of understanding, which was not precisely the anniversary of their marriage, but was the anniversary of the February evening when Amos had said Olive and she had turned from the fire, the evening they had both privately and mutually designated as the real beginning, the one before the formal beginning. The one they did not acknowledge to outsiders but acknowledged quietly to each other each year with something small: a cup of coffee left in an unexpected place, a flower on a windowsill, a note left on a ledger. The sunflowers on the south side of the house had been there for 11 years now. They came back each year from seed, a permanent installation, tall and definitive and turning always toward the available light. The prairie stretched south and the last of the day was going out of the sky in the west, and the farm lay around them like something they had built together out of work and time and care. "I have been thinking about something," Olive said. He turned to look at her. She was 41 now. Her hair was more gray than dark at the temples, and she wore it pinned up in the way she always had, and the amber ring was on her hand where it had been for 11 years, and her face was a face he knew better than he knew any other thing, knew it in every light and mood and weather, and it was still the face that could stop him in the middle of what he was doing. "What have you been thinking about?" he said. "I have been thinking that in the spring I want to expand the kitchen garden substantially," she said. "There is a good piece of ground to the north side of the house that gets enough sun, and we are not using it for anything necessary. I want to put in more variety. Squash and melons and some things I have not grown before. I want to try asparagus along the east side of that fence." He looked at her. "Asparagus takes 3 years to establish," he said. "I know," she said. "You are planning to be here in 3 years," he said, which was not a question and was also slightly more than what it appeared to be. She looked at him with that Creekwater gaze, steady and unhurried. "I am planning to be here for quite some time after that," she said. He reached over and took her hand and held it on the arm of the chair between them, the amber ring pressing warmly against his palm. He thought about September of 1878, a woman on a hollow-bellied horse, asking to work his farm until spring. He thought about October, watching her press corn seeds into the earth with an attention and a care that was something to see. He thought about February and the fire and Dickens and peppermint candies, and the very long moment after he said what needed saying and before she said what she said back. He thought about 11 years of mornings and evenings and seasons, and the work that was always there and the life that had grown up around the work and through it, sturdy and real and fully rooted. "Good," he said, and the word held everything. I will help you lay it out. The spring of 1891 arrived the way Kansas springs always did, abruptly and with conviction. The cold breaking one morning and the ground warming fast, and the air carrying the particular quality that made you want to be doing something with your hands in the soil. Olive was out with a spade and a measuring line on the north side of the house before Amos had finished his coffee, staking out the expanded kitchen garden with the focus and precision that she gave to any project that mattered to her. Walter came out and helped, 17 years old now but still happy to be his mother's assistant when she was planning something, because she always had reasons for every decision that were worth understanding. They walked the ground together and she showed him what she was thinking, and he asked good questions, and she answered them, and Amos watched from the porch with his coffee cup and the morning sun on the pale green prairie, and the feeling in his chest that he had stopped trying to name adequately because no single word was sufficient for it. Danny toddled out in his small boots and immediately sat down in the dirt and began to move it with systematic interest, and Clara came out behind him with a sigh that was entirely her father's in its quality and picked him up and set him on a cleaner piece of ground, and Danny looked at her with an expression of complete betrayal. Olive was down on one knee with her hands in the dirt, pressing it and reading it, and she looked up at Amos on the porch and said, "The soil is beautiful over here. I cannot believe we have not used this ground before. We were using it for something," he said. She looked at him. "Waiting," he said, "until you decided what it should be." She looked at him for a moment with the warmth that was fully and particularly hers, the one that had been there from early on, the morning of peppermint candies and the February fire, and had not diminished but had deepened over 11 years into something that was entirely comfortable with itself, that did not need to perform or explain. "You are a very sentimental man," she said. "I am a farmer," he said. "I understand what good ground is for." She shook her head and laughed and went back to her planting, and the morning went on around them, the children and the work and the farm, and the season turning toward what it was going to be. He set down his coffee and went to get the other spade because there was ground to prepare, and she would do it herself if he did not come, and there was no reason she should have to. They worked side by side in the morning sun, their shadows falling across the new garden beds, turning the soil and breaking up the clods and working in the compost from the pile at the back of the barn. And they did not talk very much because the work itself was a kind of conversation they had been having for years, the language of it completely natural between them, each knowing without asking what the other would do next, each adjusting and complementing and fitting together, in the work the way they did in every other aspect of the life they had made. By mid-morning they had the north bed prepared, and Olive was measuring the rows for the asparagus crowns that she had ordered from a catalog, the catalog itself worn at the spine from consultation over the winter. And Walter had gone to the barn for the trowels, and Clara had taken Danny inside for his breakfast, and the farm was in that particular state of productive morning quiet that was its own kind of music. Amos stood at the end of the prepared bed and looked at what they had done, and then at Olive kneeling at the row she had marked, pressing the first asparagus crown into the ground with her thumb at the precise depth the catalog specified, moving along the row with that unhurried attention and care that had been one of the first things he had watched her do, the thing that had told him from the very beginning that she was someone who understood how to grow things. He stood and watched her plant the seeds, the crowns, the beginnings of the asparagus bed that would take 3 years to establish and would be there long after that. And he thought about standing at a fence line 12 years ago, watching a woman approach on a hollow-bellied horse, and about how that moment had contained everything that came after it, all of it already present in the way that seeds contain the plant, the whole architecture of it waiting in the dark. She looked up and caught him standing there, and she did not say anything about the fact that he was not working, just looked at him with that direct and particular gaze and a small knowing curve at the corner of her mouth, and he thought, 12 years, and she still stops me in the middle of what I am doing. 12 years, and I am still standing here watching. And the thought was not complicated or bittersweet or weighted with anything except the simple, enormous fact of it, the gratitude for it, the plainness of it. This is the life. Right here. This ground, these hands, this woman planting in the morning sun. He picked up his trowel and went to kneel at the other end of the row. "Other end," she said without looking up. "I am working toward you, you work toward me." He moved to the other end of the row and knelt in the warm spring dirt and pressed the first crown in with his thumb at the depth she had taught him years ago, and they worked toward each other along the asparagus bed. And the Kansas sky opened above them enormous and blue, and the farm was full of the sounds of a spring morning. And Walter came back from the barn with the trowels and stood for a moment watching his parents working in the new garden bed, and thought without the words for it something true and whole about what a life looked like when it was being well lived. Clara came out of the back door with Danny on her hip, and Danny reached toward the garden with both arms in an expression of profound longing for the dirt, and Olive looked up at her daughter and said, "Bring him over. He can help." And Danny, set down on the edge of the prepared bed, took a fistful of good soil in each hand, with the complete and uncomplicated satisfaction of someone who has been given exactly what he wanted. And Olive watched him with a smile that was full of her entire self, and Amos watched her watching him, and the morning went on. In the summer of that year, they received a letter from Amos's brother Daniel in Columbus, announcing that he and his wife were coming to Kansas in September to visit, the first visit in over a decade. Amos read the letter twice at the kitchen table and then set it down and looked at Olive. "He is coming," he said. She looked at him carefully, reading the particular quality of his stillness. "How do you feel about that?" "I am not sure yet," he said. "I think I need to see him before I know." She nodded. "Then we will see him when he arrives and know then," she said, which was the practical and entirely correct approach, and which released him from having to prepare himself emotionally for a thing that had not happened yet. Daniel and his wife Margaret arrived in September, and it was one of those reunions that is at first slightly formal, and then suddenly, in the middle of some ordinary moment, completely natural again, the years collapsing in the way they do when the people on both sides of the gap actually like each other. Daniel had grown heavier and more settled-looking, and he walked through the farm with a quiet attentiveness that told Amos he remembered it, remembered the building of it, the specific cost of every structure, and that the seeing of it now, established and thriving, did something in him. He shook hands with Amos at the end of the first evening with both hands, the way their father used to shake hands when something mattered, and said, "You built something real here, Amos," and Amos said, "We built it," and looked at Olive, and Daniel followed his eyes and looked at Olive too, and she met them both with the expression that was simply her, straightforward and warm and entirely sure of herself, and Daniel said to her with real sincerity, "I can see that," and she smiled the real smile. And that was its own kind of resolution. Margaret and Olive took to each other within about 4 hours, which Amos noted with satisfaction, and which made the visit considerably easier than it might have been. The two women disappeared for half a morning into the kitchen garden, and came back discussing asparagus at a level of detail that neither Amos nor Daniel was equipped to participate in. Daniel and his wife returned to Ohio after 2 weeks with an open invitation to come back, and Amos watched the wagon take them north toward Caldwell and the railway connection, and felt something uncomplicated and good, a thread repaired, a thing that had been loose for years now properly joined again. Autumn came and the harvest was good, and the asparagus bed waited in the earth for its first full year. Olive planted garlic in October along the east edge of the bed, pressing each clove in with the same precise attention she gave to everything she planted, and Amos came and sat on the low fence beside the bed and watched her do it. "You know I have been watching you plant things for 12 years, he said. She looked up from the garlic. "I said it to you once before," he said. "Not quite in those words. On the porch the evening I brought the sunflower seeds, I said I could watch you all day. She tilted her head slightly. "You were not as direct about it then." "I was not ready to be," he said. "I am an extremely direct person now. I have had 12 years of practice being direct with you." She laughed and sat back on her heels and looked at him, and the October sun was on her face, and her hair was coming out of its pin on one side, and her hands were dark with good soil, and she looked exactly like herself, exactly like the woman who had ridden up to his fence line in September of 1878, with her careful composure and her hollow-bellied horse and her desperation held with such dignity, and also entirely different from that woman. More settled and sure and fully present in a life that was genuinely hers. "I am glad you let me stay," she said. "I am glad you asked," he said, and then stayed well past spring. She stood up and came to where he was sitting on the fence and put her hands on either side of his face, her soul-dark fingers against his jaw, and looked at him with the clear creek-water gaze that he had been looking into for 12 years and knew he would look into for as long as he was given to look. "I had every intention of leaving in spring," she said. "I know," he said. "This land changed my mind," she said. He looked at her. "Just the land," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and the October sun was warm and the garlic was planted and the asparagus was sleeping in the earth and the children were in the house, and the farm was everything around them, and she said, "No, not just the land." She kissed him then in the way that 12 years of marriage makes kisses, which is entirely natural and also never quite ordinary, and he held her and the farm held them, and the season turned toward winter. 3 years later, the asparagus came up. It came up in April, pale green spears pushing through the soil with the methodical confidence of something that had been waiting and was now simply arriving, and Olive knelt at the edge of the bed on a cool morning and looked at the first emerging growth with an expression of such particular satisfaction that Amos, watching from the gate, thought, 15 years from the fence line to right here. 15 years of this woman and this land and this life. And it is not finished. We are still in it. Still planting, still waiting, still watching things come up. Danny was 4 years old and trotted over to look at the asparagus with his mother, and said with great authority that it looked like a stick. And Olive explained that in a year or two it would be something they could eat. And Danny considered this with the deep skepticism of someone to whom a year might as well be 1,000 years. And then he noticed a frog near the fence, and the asparagus was forgotten. Clara was at school, growing into the thoughtful and precise person she had always suggested she would become. Her father's quality of observation and her mother's directness combined into something distinctly her own. Walter was 15 and already thinking about his own land someday, asking his parents careful questions about acreage and soil types and capital, planning with the seriousness that was entirely his mother in him. Amos went to stand beside Olive at the asparagus bed, and she stood up and they looked at the coming green together, the early spring morning around them still cool and the farm beginning to wake from its winter rest. "Worth the wait," he said. She slid her hand into his, the amber ring warm and worn, familiar against his palm. "Everything worth having," she said, "was worth the wait." He thought of September of 1878, and a woman at a fence line asking to work a farm until spring, and everything that had grown from that single asking, all of it already present in the seed of it, the way the asparagus had been in the earth all along. He thought, "I would stand at that fence line every day for the rest of my life and watch her ride up and ask me that, and every time I would say yes." He said none of this out loud. He held her hand in the spring morning and looked at the asparagus coming up out of good Kansas soil, and she leaned against his shoulder, and the land around them was full of growing things, and the life they had built was whole and real and entirely their own, and it was enough. It was far more than enough. It was everything, and it was still going. The sunflowers would come up again in summer. They always did.